Okay, so it's 1 o'clock, so we're gonna get started.
Or 2.
Two.
Decide you didn't want to stay?
2 o'clock, oh my gosh.
2 o'clock.
2 o'clock.
All right, let everyone into.
Oh, hey.
I love your book.
Yes, they do.
Nobody would ever put it all down.
All right, so welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So anyone who doesn't know, I'm Rachel, I'm the director here. And we are delighted to have Alice here presenting about Honora Haynes. Alice is a professor emeritus at Simmons and has a doctorate from Harvard Business School. She met Honora back in the 1980s and used to be a writer with her and has written this wonderful book that we're very happy to carry in our gift shop. And she was lucky enough to give us a wide variety of Honora's collections for after she passed. If anyone hasn't seen the delightful portrait of Honora when she was 3 years old, it's beautiful. It's out there in the hallway. Please check that out. And we have more things upstairs, and hopefully we'll be having more exhibits based on Honora and the work that she's done, which you will learn more about with Alice. So thank you all, and please welcome Alice.
Thank you. Am I on?
Someone shared their screen. I'm so sorry. Someone on Zoom, if you could please not share your screen. You're all set.
So welcome everybody, and I want to thank Rachel, and I also want to thank Beth Gray-Nix. I saw her floating around earlier, but they've both been very encouraging and supportive, and so many thanks to both of them for getting to this point. A number of you know Honora, which I think is absolutely wonderful, and there are a number of us here who not only knew Honora, sorry, excuse me, but actually had horses and rode with Honoras. So I wanted to say that I'm going to share with you, there are many interesting facets of Honora's story, and I was privileged to be able to look at the materials that Beth, who was Honora's heir and really her associate manager for many years at Broadacres, but she shared with me every box she packed and every album she had. And so I was grateful to be able to piece together, if not the complete story, but certainly a good part of the story of Honora Haynes. In the short time that we have this afternoon, I'm going to really pick something that I found very interesting. It's not necessarily the only interesting part of her life, but it's something that was personally of interest to me, and I want to share it with you. And the presentation has 3 parts. It's a short introduction where I'm going to go over the actual physical space briefly, just to get you oriented, if you will, physically to what Broadacres was and what it is now and what we hope it will become. And then the part in which I share again what was of interest to me about Honora's story, and then concluding with what are, for me, her legacy characteristics and the characteristics that I think are legacy for the town and for the wider community, because she really was a person who had impact in a quiet way many times, sometimes not so quiet, but all in a quiet way. She did have a large impact and a regional, if not, I'd say sometimes a national import. So without further ado, what I want to start off with is the 2019 public forum on what the town might do with Broadacres was an interesting start for the Broadacres legacy. And I think that if you look at this, I want to go around clockwise and just orient you again to the farm itself. So at the top, as we start at 12 o'clock, the top photograph is behind the railroad tracks on Morse Road. If you're coming up from Concord, so it's up Morse Road. On the right-hand side, you can see what is a relatively new building, which is the indoor arena. You can barely see it, but the farmer's cottage is next to that on the right-hand side of the road, And on the left-hand side of the road, which is now just has been demolished, was a small run-in shed that probably dated from when Honora bought the barn itself. Moving down around 2 or 3 o'clock, that is the Framingham Lowell Railroad line now being pulled up to be part of the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail. And that bisects the property. I'm not sure if it's east-west or north-south, but it bisects the property. And that is right before you come up Morse and see the riding arena on your right-hand side. Below that is the only photograph that we have from 1954, which is when she bought the original farm that she called Broadacres. And this is a beautiful barn built in 1920, and you'll see a later photograph of this, but Honora is sitting in a sitting on a tractor with a big grin on her face. And she has just purchased 74 point something acres. And she's about to realize the dream she has had for a number of years, which is building a horse farm. We're now going to go down Morse from Marlborough, and the 6 o'clock photograph is where probably the original house for Calvin Morse, for whom the road is named, had his house in the 1800s, late 1800s. Nothing really remains of it. But if you're coming down Morse and you look to your right, there's a level area. And that's where the house is located. And from there, you have the vantage of the wonderful rolling fields. And of course, when that was built in the 1800s, this was all pasture land. Much of what you see now is very recent growth of forests and pine, but it was pasture land, and the house looked over those rolling hills and the stock of whatever Calvin Morse had, which I think was cattle, sheep, horses, and probably some pigs and donkeys. And the last photograph is going down again closer to where you came up on the other side at 12 o'clock. And again, it's and what I'll show in the next slide. This is the beautiful broad field on the opposite side of the barn that you saw earlier at the bottom when she bought the farm in 1954. So that's kind of the modern photographs. But here is really the formal platting of the Broadacres. And you can see the red line that shows the railroad track. Again, the Framingham Lowell, it was primarily freight. And it opened up around 1860. I think trains started running certainly by 1870. Honora was aware of the trains that ran through her property until late 1960s. And she had a wonderful story about that. She said the crockery in her kitchen rattled like crazy. So everybody knew that the trains were going by, and the horses, first time they may have paid attention, second time, not so much. Third time, the trains went by, no horses paid any attention, but the crockery rattled. Now, what she bought is interesting because it's an oddly shaped piece of land. It's not, an easily circumscribed piece of land. But if you look on the, I guess, the right-hand side, that's close to Featherland. And actually what Honora bought was bigger than what you see here, because around 15 to 18 acres she gave over to the town at various times. So what she bought was 74 plus acres, and what comes to the town is around 55. But the acreage was to the right of that lower portion that's bisected by the railroad track. And if you look on the left of that illustration, the larger section that borders the Wake Robin Conservation Area, there were also some acreage that went to the town earlier from that end. Now, you can probably tell from the map that this is a watershed area. So there are ponds in Honora's area. There are streams. The Pantry Brook runs also through it. So it's a wonderful area for what has been a farm. And it certainly was a wonderful area that she bought when, as I said, she was going to realize her dream. So that, I hope, orients you to, you can see also the word cloud that people who went to this particular charrette said it was wonderful to keep this open landscape on the Morse Road area, and that it really is a beautiful and pastoral area. So what I want to share with you today is what to me is a very remarkable journey, excuse me, of a young woman who graduates from high school in 1943. And at the age of 30, about 12 or so years later, aged 30, single, she buys 75 acres of land which is a remarkable thing as you think about it. And my interest is what led her from high school to that point, and then what informed what it was that she built and what the realization of her particular dream was. So I want to start with her going from high school to college, but I also want to say that what I designated her journey as is the role creation of becoming a scholar entrepreneur. Now that's my, if you will, implication of what she did. It's not something that I believe Honora ever set out, with a strategic plan that I'm going to become a scholar and an entrepreneur. But if you look at what she did, this is really what emerged. And it's, if you think about it, in the 1950s or the 1940s when she's in college, how many women were entrepreneurs, number one, and number two, how many women actually went to college? So I think one of the first interesting statistics is to say, okay, she started off at UNH in farm management, but because of a family situation, she ended up at Stockbridge School of Agriculture at UMass Amherst in animal husbandry. And what I know from the statistics that they take is that in 1947, when she graduated, that women accounted for, wait for it, 4.5% of all bachelors. So men were 95.5% of the graduates of college. So, here was a very clear and remarkable career path, if you will, for a woman to take. And this is the scholarship that she began with. Now, some of you may think, animal husbandry, gut course. Well, let me disabuse you. Because in the 1940s, animal husbandry was then what STEM is now. And I'm sure all of you understand science, technology, engineering, and mathematics are the big fields. Well, if you look at the curriculum from Stockbridge in animal husbandry, let me inform you that it was about cultivation, management, production of domestic animals, including improvement of qualities considered desirable by humans by means of breeding. And the kinds of courses that people in this particular degree program took were the STEM courses. So what they might talk about in terms of breeding and inheritance, we know is genetics. They had to know epidemiology. They had to understand the diseases that the kinds of animals that they would be dealing with were prone to. They had to understand nutrition. So it was a very science-based degree. And again, it was a very unusual thing. I think Honora was one of two women who graduated in that particular class. It was a very unusual thing to have done. Now, that was the beginning of her scholarship. But she also, as you see in her yearbook here, had a goal, which was horse farm. And so again, I don't think Honora ever thought in terms of herself as a scholar entrepreneur. But the next several things that she did really fall under the category of entrepreneur. And that is, a scholar is somebody who goes for schooling and training to develop mastery of a particular topic. And an entrepreneur is somebody who creates, owns, manages, runs, solely responsible for a business. And the next step that Honora took, which I thought was very interesting and also very amusing, because she was a wonderful journal writer. And so we are fortunate to have some very candid, shall we say, impressions of what she's doing when she's doing it. So the next step that Honora takes, the next step that she takes after college, and was right after college, so who knows, there was a sudden opportunity or she went after it, but she ends up in Kentucky at the Lexington Stud Farm. So again, let me show you how the STEM field supports going to a stud farm in Kentucky. First of all, you understand that a stud farm is not a simple informal farm. The Kentucky probably has a, I don't know what you might call it, a gross domestic product, a gross state product of, I don't know what, due to their breeding of racehorses. That's what the state was known for. And she goes to a very well-known stud farm, which has a number of brood mares, and you understand the costs that would be involved if you want to have a racehorse that is at all effective. So you have to pay an awful lot of money for a stud fee from the stallion. Your mare is pregnant for nearly a year, which they're taking care of the mare. And then the foals are at least 2 to 3 years before you can even begin to think of whether they're going to pay off for the money you've invested them. So it's a pretty serious operation. And here she is right out of college. She goes down there and she does not have a low-level position. So here is what we have. On June 16th, she graduated probably in May. On June 16th, here's what she writes. I got up at 3:30 a.m. to get the new man started on the colts. Yearlings have to be fed at 4 a.m., 10 a.m., 5 p.m., and groomed twice a day. She used her scholarly knowledge, for example, to discover that the protein was so high in a particular pasture that some of the horses have kidney troubles. And again, this is not somebody who looks out and says, well, they seem happy. This is somebody who applies for a college degree. She took samples to Louisville to the lab for a pregnancy test, and she also supervised the building of fences. So she spends time there learning. She had been, as my two colleagues over here understand, she had ridden with the Dixons and the Morgans and knew about horse farms, but here was a very different operation. And here was a way for her to get some experience from the entrepreneur perspective. If she runs her own horse farm, what might this have helped her understand to do more effectively? When she comes back from the horse farm, she then goes over to a place close by to all of us, which was then called the Millwood Hunt Club. And it was at Waveney Farm. After a certain number of years, I think it was the 1920s, it was moved there. And it was a big place, a very big operation. It was the most important hunt club, certainly in New England area, the first one, and a very important one nationally. And she goes there at the age of 24 to work in what we would call a middle management position. That is, she reports up to the senior people who run this particular farm and barn. She's managing the riding school. So she, if you will, certainly is at least a liaison, if not oversees the part-time or the full-time teachers who come to train people to ride and the horses that are kept there. She also supervises the vast array of stable and barn help. And I have something that I'm going to take and read to you because it is such a wonderful, to me, indication of who Honora is and who Honora was. But also think about being 24 in your first job in middle management, and here's what they ask you to do. This is a letter she wrote to her mother. I've been straight out at my new job in Millwood. The club president called me at 8 a.m. and told me the building committee was meeting at 5 p.m. to discuss plans for building a new barn. And would I have ready by 5 p.m. a site plan, a barn plan, a plan for hay storage, and oh yes, a list of standard dimensions for stalls. Okay, she comes there. This is probably the first month or so. And her boss says, okay, by 5 o'clock, please have these ready for us. And then he says it to her, and don't spend any more than $10,000. And what she writes in her letter to her mother, ha ha. But she makes the deadline and she brings it in and says, the plans I submitted were accepted and they were quite good if I say so myself. She then goes on to say, I taught my first professional lesson today for $5 an hour. The pupil is a very nice Swiss doctor who wants to take 2 private lessons a week on his own horse. As he rides every day and is willing to practice his lessons, I don't see how I can fail to make a decent rider out of him. So there's no lack of courage and there's no lack of confidence in this individual. But you hear, I hope, that it's always used for the benefit of what she's doing. Because I think those of you who knew Honora would agree with me, she was completely self-effacing. These are not things I would ever have learned from her, but I learned about her, which has been wonderful. Then she goes on to say, I caught 2 of the stable help yesterday who quit for lunch at 11:50 and were not back on the job till 1:20. After I got through telling them what I thought of them, I was afraid they would all quit, but I was too mad to care. But they showed up this morning and Mr. D, one of the senior managers, complimented them on the condition of the stalls. So apparently at the moment, I've put the fear of God into them. Now listen to what she's doing in terms of, this was, the kind of intellectual things that she was doing in terms of the stable plants. Here's the physical aspects of it. I mowed the hay field this morning. I spread 3 loads of manure and painted and bandaged Dr. M's colt. I went to Raceland to check on the club horses there. Now, I just have to tell you that Raceland was not too far away on Salem End Road. It was such a prominent place for horse competitions that when they had some of the events there, they had crowds that they counted at 20,000 people. So this was an enormous operation. And there she goes, after she's mowed and spread manure and on all this, she goes out there to Raceland to check on the club horses there. Checked on the help at Millwood, ordered grain for Millwood, set the blacksmith at 4, blasted out the stable boy for being fresh to a border, and she ends, in my spare time I eat. And so it goes. Love, Honora. So while she was at Millwood, we now move, I think, back to the scholar part of the scholar entrepreneur. And that is, she met a very famous scholar himself named Vladimir Litauer, who was a captain in the Russian army. He emigrated in the 1920s. He was based, I think, primarily in New York, but he was invited to Millwood because it was such a well-known place to give clinics. And the interesting thing about him is he actually became a mentor for her. And through him, she entered another stage of her scholarly journey, if you will, that ended up at the purchase of Broadacres. What Litauer did is he studied the biomechanics of the horse, and he studied the biomechanics of the human and what the combination meant in terms of both effective and appropriate riding for whatever it was you were trying to do. And this particular scholar ended up writing at least 10 books in the time that Honora knew him. And she knew him probably through the 60s at least. I don't know, maybe into the 70s. He died at the age of 97 in 1989. But he was a mentor to her in terms of scholarship, because what he did is he introduced her to a very important organization at the time. And I have to read it because I don't remember it. She became, as he was, part of the national section on women's athletics, which is part of the American Association for Health, Physical Education, and Recreation, founded in 1985, located in Washington, D.C. This is a professional organization similar to the AMA or the American Bar Association. And I think you'll understand the scholarly aspect when I explain the charter. It says, the goal with regard to riding was to establish standards for teaching, judging, and performance based on the available sciences and determination of best practices. So this, again, I've used the term not lightly, the STEM field, that she majored in animal husbandry. And certainly there was in this organization, as there is in the AMA, for example, a basis of, what is the practice of riding and everything to do with the horse as well, that is based on sciences as well as best practices. And this particular organization, as it was similar to what board and licensing organizations do. So they would rate individuals and give them, and here's what Honora ended up going for in 1953, is going for the test of how could she teach, how well would she teach elementary and intermediate riding. And she ends up with a top rating, a rating of #1 from that particular organization. She went on to further ratings as well. But I think it was very interesting because at this point, if you think about it, Honora has the college degree, she has 2, and she's still managing Millwood, the riding school by this point. But I think she's also considering, where can I go? How can I build my horse farm? I now have, a great background for moving forward and for doing it on my own. So I think, in 1953, after she had this rating, it seems to me that she was probably looking around for available land in which she could start something that she called in her earlier college yearbook, a horse farm. And what she ended up doing, as you as I've said before, is she found a place. It had been owned, it was part of Calvin Morse's farm. It had gone to a Finnish family, and the name is Maenpa. And in Finnish, it would be pronounced Maenpo, but I think they anglicized it to something that was probably Mainpar, but I'm not sure how it was pronounced. But it was in 1920s. They bought from Calvin Morse about 75 acres, which is the piece of land that Honora bought. It went through an intermediate sale before Honora bought it, but it was essentially that family that built that beautiful barn that you saw, the wooden barn that had what is the farmer's cottage, and it really was a farmer's cottage. It's a tiny place that Honora and her sister Tish ended up living in. And then there were a couple of run-in sheds that they used for the animals that were out in the particular pastures. So Honora really becomes the entrepreneur in 1954. And what you have here are some of the same date. So the photograph that we saw earlier of Honora on her tractor, again, grinning widely. I mean, think of this as the realization of an amazing dream she's had since she went to college. It's about 12 years later, she's 30 years old. Her older sister, Tish, Letitia, comes to live with her in the farmer's cottage. And the middle photograph is of Tish, also in a tractor. So clearly, these are women not afraid of big machines. The upper left-hand corner is a little bit later of the house that they were living in. A couple of things have been added, but it was pretty much like that. And then what I love is the one of the train on the track going across bisecting the fields of Honora's farm. And that is exactly sort of where it was. So here she is. And I think, one could say it's the golden start of the realization of her dream. And what impresses me, and I didn't know the full story, of course, until much later, is that here she is, and she's invited Littauer to come in 1955 in September, he's agreed, to do some small clinic for not only she has some breeding stock she's very pleased about, and inviting some of her friends from Millwood to her clinic at her own place with the well-renowned Vladimir Littauer. And tragedy hits. In August of that year, the barn was struck by lightning. It was completely demolished. She lost 7 horses, including her most precious breeding stock and one of the mares that she had trained and brought to the various highest levels. And I think it was a cataclysm that would have stopped, a lesser person in her tracks. And what was so interesting and amazing to me is that when the glorious barn was burnt down, what Honora was able to do is to kind of restart and to think about using the bottom area of the barn, which is, of course, stone built and survived the fire, and to put a simple, what you see nowadays up on the barn, a simple structure, which the stalls were now on the bottom floor, and she had a storage area, a wooden storage area above it. And so over the next couple of years, she built the barn. She began to restock for breeding. And she managed to continue, as I said, after a cataclysm that would have stopped a lesser individual in her tracks. And remember, she's still running the Millwood Riding School. So I want to do a little fast forward to the time when she goes from Millwood Riding School and a horse farm that she's bringing into play now. And she decides around 1959 to call it Broadacres. And I always wondered why she called it Broadacres until I realized that her maternal grandparents owned a farm in Vassalboro, Maine, that they called Broadacres. And lo and behold, what was very interesting to find out is that Broadacres was also a place owned by a scholarly individual. The Sturgis family who started the Broadacres farm studied. They went to England to learn about various breeds of, in this case, sheep. They studied nutrition. They were known as the kind of ultimate example of what a farm, an effective farm, would be. In Vassalboro, Maine, she clearly was aware of it. I'm sure she'd visited it when she was a child and living in Maine. And she decided to call her own place Broadacres. And after that, she begins to think about broadening. Well, also, I think she's going to have to do one or the other. She's now running Millwood Riding School, trying to get her breeding operation going. And she decides that she is going to leave Millwood and concentrate her riding experience and her teaching experience at Broadacres itself. And so she brings, stock from Millwood that she has been working on, that the horses. She takes probably a number of the students from there. I don't know whether they had a non-compete clause or what, but certainly a number of people who rode with her in Millwood also rode with her at Broadacres. And the next thing that I think is really interesting for, again, this time, she does marketing. All right, so she has Broadacres and she decides to create a brochure. And what I love is that her brochure now sounds very much similar to what her maternal grandparents would have described as their own Broadacres. And that, let's see if I could find her brochure statements here. What she describes as is available to individuals who come to Broadacres, 75 acres of rolling pasture land. Those 75 acres comprised 5 large pastures having water and shelter, 2 large level fields used for training and exercising, a half-mile sandy racetrack. And that is actually, if I go back to this, you see where Featherland Park is and the lower portion of this area. To the right of it going towards Featherland, that's where the racetrack was. And that was something that was part of the original Broadacres. In other words, she said 30 acres of varied terrain for an outside course with every conceivable obstacle a horse is likely to meet in the show ring or the hunting field. And if we go back to here, if you look at the various jumps, you can see that they are very similar to what you, and some of these, by the way, if you go wandering through the forests that now have taken over much of the pastures at Broadacres, you can see the remains of the jumps. And it's really a wonderful walk to take to think about that when this was being run by Honora in the heyday of this particular hunting experience, they would have had, whole courses out over the 30 acres or so, and they could actually run a trial hunt, which is how they managed to judge those particular horses. Now, Honora was also somebody who was, even before she started her riding program, she was actually written up by the local papers, which I thought was very interesting. So here's before she actually starts the riding school at Broadacres. In April of 1959, writes about Honora that she has just returned from a week of intensive teaching of riding and schooling horses at the Oswego Hunt Club in Portland, Oregon. And this was the second time she was there because the first time they were so thrilled with what she did, they called her back. So the national reputation. Then I hadn't realized this. They wrote on to say, Honora Haynes was one of the originators of the Western Wayland 4-H Horse Club, the first in the country. In addition to running her farm, she's still very active in the clubs. She has recently initiated a project to train the senior members of the 2 clubs in judging horses for soundness and conformation. So there we have a person who has, as I said, I think crafted a very interesting role, particularly in her time and as a woman, and particularly, if you will, as a single woman, the scholar entrepreneur. So these are some photographs of her horses. The black and white photograph was actually taken by the Sudbury, I think it was called the Town Crier at that time. They would come and they would cover her shows. And so not only were the riders going around during the 2 days or so of the shows, but the papers were following them and they were then reported off in the sports section. I want to begin to wrap up because it can't do justice to the amount of achievements that Honora has been responsible for. And I want to say that what is interesting to me is that how many people she touched through, again, the kind of quiet and self-effacing, being the riding instructor and being the person who ran shows and being the person who ran schooling shows at the level of what you would call a rated show. So Honora's schooling shows were always renowned for being held to the highest standards. And if you could do well there, then you were probably ready to go for your first show at a rated show, which meant, if you will, I showed earlier the rating that she got from that association. That association also gave you credentials to other places that would hold horse shows. And if they met those credentials, they could then hold a rating. And so it was different to get a ribbon, if you will, for a rating show as a schooling show, but Honora's were always renowned for being the equivalent of a rated show. The newspaper account of that, this is one of the women who ended up running the horse farm right before it was sold. One of the ponds, you can't see it, but if you're walking down Morse Road from Marlborough, on the right-hand side, what she used to call the boys' field, that's the lowest field, over in the right-hand corner, left-hand corner, on the side of the railroad tracks, is a really beautiful pond. The trees are around it. You can't see it from the road, but if you're walking through there, I highly recommend you go over there. And at the end of the shows, which are always in the hottest part of the summer, Honora would invite riders, if they had brought their bathing suits, to swim their horses through the pond. And here you have a wonderful photograph of a young woman bareback swimming her horse, and behind her is another horse you can barely see, but the head of the horse has got swing dog pedal through the pond. Now, as one of the other things I discovered by being a boarder with Honora was that it was interesting to me how many professional people boarded and took lessons with her. So, you had a number of professors, you had a number of people going for their veterinary degree, you had people going for medical degree, you had lawyers, you had CPAs. And I thought this was, interesting. And it, if you will, it probably wasn't so much random as the fact that the people who tended to be with Honora were people who needed to understand and have her be able to answer the question, why? Why am I doing this? Why is my horse acting this way? What can I do? And as opposed to telling people, sit here, leg here, hands here, she would say, from the perspective of biomechanics, you need to do it this way because. And again, you can see the training from her mentorship with Litauer, but also what she herself had learned, certainly when she was doing her scholarly work at Stockbridge School of Agriculture. So, she appealed to people who, again, wanted to understand why they were doing something, not just to be told to do something. And as her very faithful demographics aged, and many of us professional women might not have wanted to be in such, places like this, leaping over large fences at speed. What Honora did, and I think was quite wonderful, she adapted, and as she was also aging. So we moved into dressage, which is like figure skating on horseback, if any of you don't know about dressage. But again, it's an intellectual pursuit. Why are you doing it? And what do you need to think about why you're doing it? Honora was then, as she left, she stopped riding at 75. And she was, hampered, as many people at that age are, with arthritis, and so was not so much individually teaching. Beth Davis, who is her heir, and certainly her, again, associate manager, was the head instructor. But Honora would coach, and so she would often drive down to the fields in her truck, and she would sit there. And if you were riding by yourself, she was not shy about telling you things that you should or shouldn't do and explaining why. And was always known at the shows because, again, she was not shy really about telling anybody at the shows, but she was also known for her hat. And there is a wonderful, I think, photograph of Honora with her hats. I want to have a short conclusion, which is my personal understanding of what her legacy is and what I think is a wonderful legacy, and the legacy that I took away from living with her through the archives and learning about her for the many months I spent. Now, Honora did what she loved. And I think it's something that it's easy to say, but it's hard to put into practice to the same degree that she was able to. I mean, she always loved, she was she was really a prodigy as a child. She was a remarkable athlete. She had a wonderful sense of confidence and she was completely risk willing. She wasn't foolish, but she was very risk willing. And I think she could have been a professional sailor. She could have done sailing professionally. She certainly could have done diving professionally. She's a high diver in the most remarkable way. But she loved horses. And so what could she do that would be a career for her and support her throughout her life, which it did, and still, if you will, fulfill that love of horses? And she managed to do that, and she managed to do it in a very, again, looking back retrospectively, in a very systematic way. She went through the schooling, she took advantage of the opportunities that gave her experiences that, would be certainly to her advantage. And then she was able to adapt as needed. And working hard and persevering is something that anyone who knew her understood that. I mean, she worked amazingly hard. And when you think about the fact that she ran a second riding school along with her own farm for, more than 10 years. And then she ran this particular farm. There's no vacation. If you have livestock, if you have horses, if you're running a business like this, you can't take a vacation. The only time you get away is when somebody is going to live in your house and take care of them to your standards. So, this wasn't an easy vocation or career to have. And the other thing that I think was remarkable is she was part of the community. So what you see down here in the bottom corner is Honora on her scooter when she needed help getting around. And the horse shows were certainly part of what was going on in the community. But Honora's students were also children of either riders who had been with her in Millwood or riders who had ponies of their own, and they came to her summer sessions, which were like summer camp on horses. And the remarkable thing to me is also that we talk about customer facing and customer focus. Well, the wonderful thing about Honora's impact on her customers is that they stayed with her. And even if they moved away or they aged out or, their careers took precedence over riding, they were always in touch. She got phone calls, she got visits, people dropped in. And I think one of the biggest attestations about her customer loyalty is that when she was 90 years old, Beth Davis held a birthday party for her at the Wayside Inn. She had to hold it over 2 days because there were so many people from all around the country who wanted to come and celebrate that. So I want to end with that and to say that, this is something I think that we need to keep and preserve because it really is a wonderful legacy. And there are Honora's people, around and who know her and so forth, and who have those life lessons. A number of people going through the lessons they wrote to her said, you changed my life. And I think it was not only that, you learned to ride better, but you learned something was way beyond just the riding better. And that was, again, as I said, some of this legacy of doing what you love, of understanding why you're doing something and understanding how you can actually do it better. So I'd like to stop now and ask if you have questions. I know there are some people who knew Honora way back when, and certainly there are a number of us who had boarded with Honora. So, please feel free. Love to hear from you with questions. And then that.
Well, I just want to mention, as a neighbor for the last 15, 16 years, I saw her many times in the field mowing her own lawn.
Yes, yes. And spreading the manure.
And the straw hat.
And the straw hat. Yes, yes. Thank you. It was lovely to see you. Okay. Yes. Waveney Farm.
Yes. I just wanted to verify that my father ran Waveney Farm for his whole life, and that I rode with the Millwood Hunt at the back over the jumps. And the reason I was at the end is because we had to put back the fences for 125 registered Broadacres cows.
That is wonderful. Do we have any photographs of you riding on the hunt? I've got some wonderful ones of some of the smaller boys riding these big ponies over these huge jumps. I mean, it makes my palms sweat just looking at the jumps. Yeah. Okay. Questions? Yes, sir. And then behind.
Was you related to the Sudbury Haynes.
No, she was related to the Maine Haynes. So there was a shipwreck in Penobscot, I think, around that area. And the English Haynes, certainly one family, and certainly back in England, that was one family. The Maine Haynes, which was her grandfather, they lived in Augusta. And the ones who came down to the lower part of New England settled in Sudbury. So back in England, it was the same family, but they seem to have split because when the ships came over, they came over in different times and they stayed in Maine versus in Sudbury. So yes, sort of. They came down, their ships from England came down lower than Nova Scotia and Maine, and the Maine Haynes stayed up in the Nova Scotia, Maine area. Yeah. And there's a question behind.
Oh, yeah. So thank you so much for doing this. It's so interesting. I walk a lot on Broadacres, and I'm just curious. So was the way the land is, was that how she bought it? Kind of separate.
Yes, it was.
Story behind that? I'm just curious.
No, it was just, they built the rail through. So the railroad took preeminent domain and simply cut through the straightest path from Framingham to Lowell. Why Calvin Morse sold off, the big plot into those smaller areas isn't clear. Part of it has to do with wetlands. I think they probably decided that they wanted to keep some of that separate, and so took it out of whatever it was going to be. But yeah, and again, Honora bought more land than you actually see on that particular diagram, because some of it on the side of the Wake Robin Conservation Area, she deeded over to the town earlier, and the racetrack, which I'm always interested to think that there was a racetrack there. Yeah.
Didn't she sell some off the development too?
No. Her mother had bought, after Honora bought this particular plot of land, there were 2 house lots further up on Morse Road beyond the beautiful wooden barn. Her mother, who was living in Weston, bought 2 plots of land to give her some buffer so that as Morse Road was being developed, it wouldn't come too close to the barn. And at some point, she did sell those off, but she sold them off to 2 house lots and built the indoor arena. That was how she paid for that. Yeah.
But they stayed house lots. They weren't actually part of the farm.
No, they just stayed house lots. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was in the original Western Wayland 4-H horse club.
Oh, we love it. Okay, tell us.
Oh, wow, it was a long time ago.
Well, there's still.
Well, we had mostly Morgans.
Yeah.
And, but Honora was more into the hunting.
Yeah.
Club business, but
Yeah.
it was wonderful. I remember her and her sister, and of course Mrs. Dixon and Anna Eagle and
Yeah.
Phyllis Cox and Nuki Rayner, and all the
Names that I've
original
heard.
leaders of the 4-H horse club that we had. We
Yeah.
had regular shows every year. And
I think that's wonderful.
it was great.
Yeah, especially through, yeah. I was going to say, I was lucky enough early, I met Honora through a friend here in the early 1980s. And I can remember doing summer session where you had a group of individuals ranging in age from probably 10 to, I will hesitate to say this, but 40. And there we were when we were just, it didn't matter the age range. We were just all together trying to learn what it was that we needed to be able to do the complete test of a hunter test at the very end of summer session. And it was enormous fun. It was just a wonderful thing. And again, this was part of Honora's being embedded in the neighborhood, is running these wonderful summer sessions. And I'd like to hear that, you actually experienced the 4-H as well. Yeah.
I have a question from Zoom.
Good.
In Northeast Pennsylvania, nearly all, or perhaps all, the horse farms that had riding schools were run by women who grew up during the Depression. Was this true here in Massachusetts, that women dominated the field after World War II?
Yes, absolutely. And, the interesting thing is that if you think about the woman who was just talking about the 4-H club, that was Ellen Dixon, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, who was running the Morgan show. And actually Honora and Tish, especially Honora, competed some of the Morgans for her in the downtown, the Armory, I think in downtown Boston. But yes, absolutely, during the Depression. Yeah.
animal husbandry versus veterinary medicine, how did they connect back in those days?
Well, veterinary medicine is obviously on morbidity, mortality, and epidemiology, but animal husbandry would take into account a portion of that, but also focus on much more than veterinary school would have done, probably has done doing more nutrition. So you'd have nutrition and genetics, and that would not be so much the focus in veterinary medicine.
It sounds as though much of what she did was what a vet would do.
Yeah, yes, indeed. In fact, there are stories, when a horse has colic, Honora had the medicines and she knew what to do. And, the vet was called only if those didn't work. So. Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, thank you for this talk. It's great. I got to know Nora briefly when she had turned about 80 because we had just moved from Harvard Square to Marlborough Road, and did some writing lessons with her. So you knew her personality, in a day when everybody says great job all the time.
No.
One word of praise from her was so valuable because she didn't give that easily.
No. Thank you. That's right. I remember she said to me, that I guess my better part was that I was intelligent enough to know when I shouldn't do something. So that's okay. I'll take that as a compliment.
I can see why people were attracted to her. When she was a scholarly person, you could really have a satisfying conversation.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
my mother, who was about the same age, who was in Sri Lanka, where I'm originally from, and I often would exchange notes
Yeah.
about her. And then when I had family visiting, my niece, who loved horses, wanted to do some riding lessons, but it was so expensive.
Mm.
They allowed her to come and hang out at the stables and watch the riding. So yeah, she was very kind.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
stern exterior was.
Yes. Yeah. And she was so self-effacing. I mean, I didn't know these things. And there's, again, more interesting things about her upbringing, because some of you may know, she was one of 3 non-biologically related children adopted by a single woman in the 1920s. And the single woman, Muriel Sturgis Haynes, was a graduate of Smith 1904. So it was a very interesting family and a very interesting background to come from. She actually came from great wealth. Muriel was one of the Haynes, as this gentleman was saying, the Haynes from Maine, and they were extremely wealthy. And she comes with her sister to live in this farmer's cottage, and she's out there spreading manure and mowing the lawn. And you'd never know that she came from that.
One of the things that showed her connection to the land was when she was a child. We have wonderful pictures of her camping out.
Yeah.
So it doesn't surprise me that she was able to go and work the farm. It didn't bother her in the least.
Yeah.
And she going to Millwood and running the farms there, and then doing a lot on her own. Very unusual for a woman at that time.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And Beth has been with me when we've gone through the marvelous albums. And by the way, if anybody has photo albums, which nobody does anymore, all I could say after months of going through and trying to piece things together was, please label your photographs. Please label your photographs.
Dates are nice too. Because we have tons of photographs, and we'll get them in from people and they have not a clue who they are. And they would like to know, and it's we keep them, but they're definitely in the who on earth is this? And sometimes I'll go to the older members in the community, or Ellen Meaderman will post them for us on Facebook.
If you
Does
recognize,
anybody know who this is? And there was a wonderful one on Bottle Bill on Facebook the other day, and getting the right, somebody thought he was Ed Chubbuck and he's not. But pulling those pictures and making sure that they're labeled properly. So when people come to us in the future and say, who is this? We can actually tell you.
and by the way, it was Beth who digitized. We have Beth Davis, who is, again, Honora's heir, gave me a box of film reels from the 1920s. So Beth was able to have those digitized, and at some point we hope there'll be a kiosk in which we can see them. But there are some wonderful short movies, clips of Honora at the age of probably 3 on a fairly large pony with her legs out like this because she's too small to wrap them around the pony. Completely self-assured. And the best one is, as a 3-year-old, Honora is taking the pony back to the barn. She's this high. The pony is a fairly large pony, and the pony's, okay. Okay, I'm coming. She had that already. Yeah.
The other
Yep.
thing I wanted to mention is, as you read this, there's a portrait of Honora on your way out, on the wall. And if you look up the stairs, there's another portrait of Letitia.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you.
Alice, as you look